The fisherman's sonar showed something that shouldn't have been there. 25 feet below the muddy waters of the Wabash River, a shadow with wings that had been waiting 35 years to tell its story. When they pulled Mike Harrison's red and white Cessna from the depths in 2016, his hands were still gripping the controls, frozen in time from that gray November morning in 1981 when he simply vanished from the sky. The alarm clock buzzed at 5:30 a.m. on November 15, 1981, but Mike Harrison was already awake. He had been for the past 20 minutes, lying in bed next to his sleeping wife Sarah, listening to the wind rattle the windows of their small house on Maple Street. It was the kind of morning that made pilots check the weather twice, maybe 3 times before deciding whether to fly. Mike slipped out of bed quietly, careful not to wake Sarah or the kids. 8-year-old Tommy had a math test today, and 6-year-old Lisa had been fighting a cold all week. They needed their sleep. He padded to the kitchen in his stocking feet and started the coffee maker, then pulled back the curtain to peer outside. The streetlights glowed through a thick layer of fog, but he could see the outline of his neighbor's house across the street. Not great, but not impossible either. By 6:15, Mike was dressed in his standard uniform, a crisp white shirt with black pants and his captain's wings pinned to his chest. He had worn those wings with pride for 8 years now, ever since he left the Air Force and started his charter service. Flying had been his dream since he was Tommy's age, watching crop dusters work the fields around Springfield. Now, at 34, he couldn't imagine doing anything else. The drive to Springfield Regional Airport took 12 minutes through the quiet streets. Mike knew every turn, every stop sign, every pothole. He had made this drive hundreds of times, in sunshine and snowstorms, at dawn and midnight. Today felt like any other day. The small terminal building was mostly dark except for the security lights and the glow from the flight service station where pilots checked weather and filed flight plans. Inside, Mike poured himself another cup of coffee and spread the weather charts across the metal table. The forecast called for overcast skies with fog along the river valleys, but visibility was supposed to improve by mid-morning. His passenger, a businessman named Robert Chen, needed to be in Chicago by noon for an important meeting. It was a routine flight in Mike's Cessna 172, tail number N2000, 847X, a reliable aircraft he had owned for 3 years and maintained meticulously. At 7:45 a.m., Chen arrived at the terminal, looking nervous. He had never flown in a small plane before, he admitted to Mike while they walked out to the aircraft. Mike smiled and gave him the same reassuring speech he had given dozens of first-time passengers. "This little bird has taken me safely over 100,000 miles, he said, patting the red and white wing of the Cessna. "She'll get us to Chicago just fine." The pre-flight inspection took 20 minutes. Mike checked every rivet, every control surface, every fluid level. He tested the engine, checked the fuel, examined the propeller for nicks or damage. Everything looked perfect. The Cessna 172 was in excellent condition, just like always. At 9:30 a.m., Mike fired up the engine and called the tower for clearance. "Springfield Tower, Cessna 2000, 847X ready for departure. VFR to Chicago Midway." The controller's voice crackled back. 2000, 847X, cleared for takeoff runway 22, fly heading 45, contact departure. The Cessna lifted off smoothly into the gray morning sky. Janet Morrison had been working air traffic control for 12 years, and she knew the sound of trouble. It wasn't always dramatic, screaming engines or panicked voices on the radio. Sometimes trouble was just silence where there should have been a voice. She glanced at the clock on her console. 10:15 a.m. Cessna 2000, 847X, should have checked in 15 minutes ago. Mike Harrison was one of the most reliable pilots who used Springfield Regional. He always called right on time, his voice calm and professional. Janet had guided him through hundreds of flights over the years. He wasn't the type to forget a radio call. "Cessna 2847X, Springfield departure," she called into her headset microphone. Static filled her headphones. She tried again, louder this time. "2847X, Springfield departure. Please respond." Nothing but the empty hiss of radio silence. Janet felt her stomach tighten. She pulled up Harrison's flight plan on her computer screen. He was flying VFR, visual flight rules, which meant he was responsible for his own navigation and separation from other aircraft. His route took him northeast toward Chicago, following the Wabash River Valley for most of the trip. In good weather, it was an easy flight. but the fog had been thicker than forecast this morning, especially over the river. She tried a different frequency. 2847X, Springfield departure on 121.9. How do you hear? Still nothing. Janet looked around the control room. Only 2 other controllers were on duty this morning, both busy with their own aircraft. She made the decision that every controller dreads but trains for constantly. Jim, she called to her supervisor, I think we have a problem. 30 minutes later, Sarah Harrison was folding laundry in her bedroom when the phone rang. She almost didn't answer it. Tommy was at school, Lisa was finally napping after being up half the night with her cough, and Sarah was enjoying the rare quiet moment. But something made her pick up the phone on the 4th ring. Mrs. Harrison, this is Janet Morrison from Springfield Airport Air Traffic Control. The woman's voice was careful, professional, but Sarah could hear something underneath it. Fear, maybe, or regret. We've lost radio contact with your husband's aircraft, Janet continued. He was due to check in with us at 10:00 a.m., and we haven't heard from him. We've been trying to reach him for over an hour now. Sarah sat down hard on the edge of the bed, the basket of clean clothes tumbling to the floor. What does that mean? Lost contact? It could be several things, Janet said quickly. Radio failure is the most common cause. Pilots lose radios all the time, Mrs. Harrison. It doesn't necessarily mean anything is wrong with the aircraft itself. He might have landed somewhere to check his equipment, or diverted to another airport because of the weather. But Sarah had been a pilot's wife for 10 years. She knew that Mike carried a backup radio. She knew he had emergency procedures drilled into his memory. She knew that if he could call, he would call. We've already contacted search and rescue, Janet was saying. They're preparing to launch aircraft to look for him along his route. Mrs. Harrison, I want you to know that we're doing everything we can. Sarah hung up the phone and stared at the scattered laundry on the floor. Somewhere out there, Mike's voice had simply vanished from the sky. By noon, the Springfield Regional Airport looked like a military operation. Cars and trucks filled every available parking spot. The Civil Air Patrol had set up a command tent near the main hangar, its olive-green canvas flapping in the wind. Radio chatter filled the air as pilots checked their aircraft and studied maps spread across folding tables. Colonel Frank Winters had run search and rescue operations for 15 years, but each one still felt personal. Somewhere out there was a pilot who might be injured, might be waiting for help, might be counting the minutes until rescue arrived. Time was everything in situations like this. We're looking at a 60-mile corridor, Winters told the assembled volunteers, pointing to a large sectional chart taped to the side of the command trailer. Harrison's planned route follows the Wabash River Valley from here to just south of Chicago. Weather was marginal this morning, fog especially thick over the water. Sarah Harrison stood at the edge of the group, her arms wrapped around herself against the cold November wind. She had dropped Lisa off with her neighbor Mrs. Patterson and picked Tommy up early from school. Her son sat in their car now, doing homework while she listened to the search plans. Tommy kept asking when Daddy would be home. Sarah didn't know what to tell him. The first search planes took off at 12:30 p.m. 4 Cessnas and 2 Pipers, each with a pilot and observer, spread out along Harrison's route. From the air, they could see the brown ribbon of the Wabash River winding through farmland and patches of forest. The autumn fog had mostly lifted, leaving gray clouds hanging low over the water. If stories like this move you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share in the comments where you're watching from. 46. Thanks for watching, and you need to subscribe. Dr. Martin Webb, a local dentist who volunteered with Civil Air Patrol, flew the southernmost search pattern. He had known Mike Harrison for years, had flown with him on several charity flights. Webb pressed his face to the window of his Cessna 182, scanning the landscape below for any sign of wreckage. There, his observer, a college student named Rick Santos, pointed toward a section of riverbank about 20 miles northeast of Springfield. Those white pieces by the water. Webb banked the aircraft for a better look. Scattered along the muddy shoreline were several pieces of white and red metal, some no bigger than dinner plates, others the size of car doors. They looked fresh, bright against the brown earth. Webb felt his stomach drop. Civil Air Patrol Base, this is Search Aircraft 1, Webb radioed. We have possible debris located at grid reference Mike Foxtrot 7. Appears to be aircraft parts, red and white coloring. Requesting ground team to investigate. 20 minutes later, 2 sheriff's deputies and a Civil Air Patrol ground team reached the debris field. Deputy Steve Marcus had worked plane crashes before, but he always hoped he wouldn't find what he was looking for. He picked up a piece of twisted metal about 2 feet long. Part of an aircraft wing. Definitely. The red and white paint scheme matched the description of Harrison's Cessna. "Base, this is Ground Team Alpha," Marcus radioed back to the command post. "We've got confirmed aircraft debris, requesting NTSB notification and expanded search of the river area." At the airport, Sarah Harrison heard the radio transmission. She closed her eyes and felt the world shift beneath her feet. Mike Harrison had wanted to fly since the day his grandfather took him to the county fair when he was 7 years old. They had watched a barnstormer in a bright yellow biplane loop and roll through the summer sky above the cornfields. And Mike knew right then what he wanted to do with his life. His grandfather, a farmer who had never been more than 50 miles from home, just smiled and said, "Well then, boy, I guess you better start studying." And study he did. While other kids played baseball or rode bikes, Mike buried himself in aviation magazines and library books about airplanes. He built model aircraft in his bedroom and could identify any plane by the sound of its engine long before it appeared in the sky. His parents, practical people who ran the local hardware store, worried about their son's expensive dreams, but never tried to talk him out of them. After high school, Mike enlisted in the Air Force. Vietnam was still raging, and young pilots were desperately needed. He earned his wings at Williams Air Force Base in Arizona, then spent 2 tours flying cargo planes in and out of Saigon. The work was dangerous, landing on short jungle airstrips while mortars exploded nearby, but Mike never lost his love for flying. If anything, the military taught him that aviation was about more than just the romance of flight. It was about precision, discipline, and keeping calm when everything around you was falling apart. When he came home in 1975, Mike used his GI benefits to get his commercial pilot's license and started looking for work. The airlines weren't hiring many pilots then, so he took whatever flying jobs he could find. He flew medical supplies to rural hospitals, carried mail to small towns, and gave flying lessons to weekend warriors. The pay was terrible, but he was building flight hours and living his dream. That's how he met Sarah, at a church potluck dinner in 1973. She was a nurse at Springfield General Hospital, and Mike was flying blood samples between small-town clinics and the main lab. Sarah thought pilots were reckless show-offs until she met Mike. He was quiet, thoughtful, the kind of man who checked and double-checked everything before making a decision. When he proposed 2 years later, he did it on the ground, not in an airplane, because Sarah was still nervous about flying. They were married in June 1975, and Mike started his charter service 6 months later with a used Cessna 172 and a business loan that scared them both. But the timing was right. Springfield was growing, and business people needed quick transportation to Chicago, St. Louis, and Indianapolis. Mike's reputation for safety and reliability grew quickly. He never took unnecessary risks, never flew in weather that made him uncomfortable, never let schedule pressure override good judgment. Tommy was born in 1973, Lisa in 1975. Mike would take them to the airport on weekends, let them sit in the pilot's seat and pretend to fly. Tommy loved it, but Lisa was more interested in the radio equipment. "I want to talk to the airplanes," she would say. Mike would smile and tell Sarah, "That girl's going to be a controller someday." Now Mike was 34, with 8 years of charter flying behind him and dreams of maybe buying a bigger airplane, a twin-engine Beechcraft that could carry more passengers and fly in worse weather. He was building something, creating a legacy for his family. The debris field stretched along nearly 300 yards of riverbank, scattered like puzzle pieces that would never fit together again. Sheriff's Deputy Steve Marcus had seen car wrecks, house fires, and farm accidents, but aircraft crashes were different. The violence of impact spread wreckage across impossible distances, turning a once proud flying machine into twisted metal and broken dreams. Over here, called Civil Air Patrol volunteer Jim Patterson, waving from a muddy section near the water's edge. He was kneeling beside a piece of red and white fiberglass, about the size of a briefcase. "This looks like part of the engine cowling." Marcus made his way carefully through the thick November mud, taking photographs as he went. Each piece of debris was evidence now, a clue that might help investigators understand what had happened to Mike Harrison and his passenger. The metal pieces were scattered in a rough line parallel to the river, suggesting the aircraft had been flying low when it broke apart. Dr. Martin Webb, the dentist who had spotted the wreckage from the air, landed his search plane at a nearby farm strip and drove to the crash site. As both a pilot and a Civil Air Patrol member, he had training in aircraft accident investigation. What he saw made his heart sink. "This is definitely from a Cessna 172, Webb told the growing crowd of searchers and law enforcement officers. He picked up a piece of twisted aluminum. "See these rivet patterns? And this red and white paint scheme matches Harrison's aircraft exactly. The largest piece of wreckage was a section of the right wing, about 6 feet long and still recognizable as part of an airplane. Deputy Marcus carefully turned it over, looking for any identifying marks. There, barely visible through the mud and scratches, were 3 letters and a number, 847X, the tail number of Harrison's aircraft. But the discovery that sent chills through everyone at the scene came from Patterson's trained eye. He had found something about 50 yards downstream from the main debris field, something that didn't belong with the twisted metal and broken fiberglass. A dark stain spread across the muddy riverbank, too thick to be water, too fresh to be old. "That's oil," Patterson said, pointing to the stain. "Aircraft engine oil." Marcus knelt beside the dark patch and touched it with his finger. The oil was still wet, still spreading slowly into the surrounding mud. He looked up at the river, flowing brown and swift from recent rains. If an aircraft had crashed into the water, the oil would have floated downstream before washing up on the bank. "How deep is the river here?" Marcus asked, a local farmer who had arrived to help with the search. "This time of year, with all the rain we've had, maybe 25, 30 feet in the channel," the farmer replied. "But it's been higher. Last week it was over the banks in some places." Webb studied the debris pattern again, then looked out at the dark water flowing past. Aircraft wreckage on the bank, fresh oil stains, but no sign of the main fuselage or the cockpit. No sign of Mike Harrison or his passenger. The river had taken them. "We need divers," Marcus said into his radio. "And we need them fast." But even as he spoke, he knew the river was winning this race against time. Tom Bradley had investigated airplane crashes for the National Transportation Safety Board for 18 years, and he could read wreckage like other people read books. Every twisted piece of metal told a story about the final moments of flight, about what went wrong and why. But as he stood on the muddy banks of the Wabash River 3 days after Mike Harrison's disappearance, Bradley knew this investigation would be different. Half the story was missing, somewhere beneath 25 feet of dark, cold water. "What we have here is a classic debris pattern for an in-flight breakup," Bradley explained to the assembled investigators. He pointed to the scattered pieces of aircraft spread along the riverbank. "The wreckage is distributed in a line roughly parallel to the water, which suggests the aircraft was flying low when it started coming apart." Bradley's team had been cataloging and photographing each piece of debris since dawn. The engine cowling, sections of wing skin, pieces of the instrument panel, fragments of the propeller, all bore the distinctive red and white paint scheme of Harrison's Cessna 172. But the crucial pieces, the ones that would tell them exactly what happened, were still missing. "No main fuselage, no cockpit area, no engine block," Bradley continued. "Those are the heaviest components. If the aircraft broke up over water, they would have gone straight down." The weather analysis painted a troubling picture. National Weather Service meteorologist Carol Jenkins had reconstructed the atmospheric conditions along Harrison's flight path on the morning of November 15th. What she found made Bradley grimace. Fog was much thicker than forecast, Jenkins reported, spreading weather charts across the hood of a sheriff's patrol car. Visibility dropped to less than a quarter mile in some areas along the river valley, and we had perfect conditions for carburetor icing. Carburetor icing was every pilot's nightmare, especially in small aircraft like Harrison's Cessna. When moist air passed through the carburetor at certain temperatures, ice could form rapidly, choking off fuel flow to the engine. In thick fog, a pilot might not realize what was happening until the engine quit completely. Temperature was 38 degrees, humidity at 95%, Jenkins continued. Textbook conditions for icing. If Harrison encountered icing in the carburetor, he would have had very little time to react. Bradley walked to the water's edge and stared out at the brown current. Somewhere beneath that murky surface lay the answers he needed. Harrison's aircraft, his body, his passenger, the cockpit instruments that might show what the pilot was trying to do in those final moments. Deputy Marcus approached with news that made Bradley's job even harder. "Divers went down this morning," Marcus reported. "Visibility is 0. They can't see their hands in front of their faces down there, and the current is running about 4 knots. Too dangerous for extended searches." Bradley nodded grimly. Winter was coming, and the river would only get worse. Ice would form along the banks, making any recovery operation impossible until spring. If they were going to find Harrison's aircraft, they had to do it soon. "Get me sonar equipment," Bradley told Marcus. "The best you can find. We're going to map every inch of this river bottom." But even as he spoke, Bradley knew they were fighting time and nature, and both were winning. The gymnasium at Springfield High School had never hosted anything quite like this. Folding chairs arranged in neat rows faced a simple podium decorated with aviation photos and a pair of silver pilot's wings. Nearly 400 people filled the space, their quiet conversations creating a low hum that reminded Sarah Harrison of the sound Mike's Cessna made when he was running engine checks on Sunday mornings. Pastor David Coleman from First Methodist Church stepped to the microphone at exactly 7 o'clock on the evening of November 20th, 5 days after Mike disappeared. Sarah sat in the front row between Tommy and Lisa, her children pressed close against her sides. Tommy wore his Little League uniform because Mike had never missed a game, and Lisa clutched a small model airplane that her father had given her for her 6th birthday. "We gather tonight not to mourn but to hope," Pastor Coleman began, his voice carrying clearly through the gymnasium. "Mike Harrison is more than just a missing pilot. He's a husband, a father, a friend, a neighbor. He's part of our community, and we're not giving up on him." Behind the pastor, a large map showed the search area along the Wabash River. Red pins marked where debris had been found, blue pins showed where ground teams had searched, and yellow pins indicated where aircraft had flown search patterns. The map looked like a battle plan, which in many ways it was, a battle against time and weather and the vastness of the countryside. Dr. Martin Webb spoke next, representing the Civil Air Patrol volunteers who had been flying search missions since Monday. His voice was tired but determined. "We've flown over 300 flight hours this week," he told the crowd. "We've covered every inch of Mike's planned route and expanded the search area by 50 square miles. We're not stopping." The local pilot community had responded with overwhelming support. Charter companies from 3 states had donated aircraft and fuel. Private pilots had taken vacation days to join the search. The fixed base operator at Springfield Regional was providing free hangar space for visiting search aircraft and had set up a 24-hour coordination center. "Mike Harrison would have done the same for any one of us," said Captain Jerry Walsh from Midwest Charter Service. "That's the kind of man he island. That's the kind of pilot he island. We take care of our own." Sarah finally stood to speak, her hands shaking as she gripped the podium. The gymnasium fell completely silent. Even the children stopped fidgeting. "My husband loves to fly," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But he loves his family more. If Mike could come home to us, he would. If he could call, he would. Something happened out there. Something that kept him from coming home. But I know Mike. He's strong. He's smart. He's a survivor." She paused, looking out at the sea of faces, neighbors who had become family in these dark days. "Keep looking for him," Sarah said. "Please, just keep looking." The vigil ended with everyone holding battery-powered candles, tiny points of light in the darkness, visible for miles around Springfield, like a beacon calling Mike Harrison home. The first call came on a Tuesday morning, 6 days after Mike disappeared. Sarah was washing breakfast dishes when the phone rang, and she nearly dropped a coffee mug when she heard Deputy Marcus's excited voice. "Mrs. Harrison, we might have something. A truck driver thinks he saw your husband at a gas station in Terre Haute yesterday evening," said a man matching Mike's description was asking for directions, seemed confused, maybe injured. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she drove the 40-minute trip to the gas station with Tommy and Lisa in the back seat. The children had missed too much school already, but she couldn't bear to leave them behind. What if it was really Mike? What if he was hurt, suffering from amnesia, wandering around Indiana not knowing who he was? The gas station clerk, a teenager with greasy hands and tired eyes, shook his head when he saw Mike's photograph. "No, ma'am, that's not the guy. The man I saw was older, had a beard. Sorry." Sarah drove home in silence while Tommy asked over and over why Daddy wasn't at the gas station like the policeman said he would be. The calls kept coming. Mike Harrison was spotted buying coffee in Lafayette. He was seen walking along a highway near Brazil. A waitress in Vincennes was certain she had served him eggs and toast on Thursday morning. Each report sent search teams racing across Indiana, following leads that evaporated like morning fog. The worst false hope came from a woman named Crystal Matthews, who claimed to be psychic. She called the sheriff's office on Friday afternoon, her voice breathless with excitement. "I see him," Crystal insisted when Deputy Marcus reluctantly took her call. "He's near water, lots of trees around. There's an old red barn, maybe a farmhouse. He's alive but hurt, can't move very well. I think his leg is broken." Crystal's vision was so detailed, so specific, that Marcus felt obligated to check it out. She described a location about 12 miles northwest of where the debris had been found, an area that search teams hadn't thoroughly covered. Sarah begged to come along when Marcus organized a ground search based on Crystal's directions. They found the red barn exactly where Crystal said it would be, weathered and leaning slightly to one side. They found the farmhouse, abandoned for years with broken windows and weeds growing through the front porch. They searched every building, every ditch, every patch of woods within 2 miles. They found rusted farm equipment, an old car chassis, and 3 stray cats. They did not find Mike Harrison. I was so sure, Crystal told Sarah afterward, tears in her eyes. I could see him so clearly. Sarah wanted to scream at the woman, wanted to shake her and demand to know why she would give false hope to a family already drowning in despair. Instead, she just walked away, back to the car where Tommy and Lisa were waiting, back to the terrible uncertainty that had become their daily life. By Thanksgiving, the official search had been suspended. Winter weather was making flying dangerous, and there were simply no more leads to follow. Mike Harrison had vanished as completely as if he had never existed at all. The hardest part wasn't the empty chair at the dinner table or the silent hangar where Mike's tools still hung on their pegboard hooks. The hardest part was not knowing. Sarah Harrison discovered that grief, without a body, without certainty, was a special kind of torture that left her suspended between hope and despair, unable to move forward but afraid to let go. Christmas morning arrived gray and cold. 6 weeks after Mike disappeared, Tommy and Lisa tore through their presents with forced enthusiasm while Sarah sat on the couch, clutching a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. Under the tree sat Mike's gifts, still wrapped in the red paper Sarah had chosen back in October when the world made sense. A new flight bag, a subscription to Aviation Week magazine, a framed photo of the family taken at the county fair last summer. When is Daddy coming home to open his presents? Lisa asked for the 10th time that morning. At 6 years old, she couldn't understand why everyone kept saying they didn't know. Adults were supposed to know everything. Adults were supposed to fix problems and make things right. Tommy, at 8, was old enough to understand that something terrible had happened, but too young to process the permanence of it. He had taken to sleeping with his baseball glove, the one Mike had given him for his birthday. Dad's going to want to play catch when he gets back, Tommy told his mother. I need to stay ready. The phone calls from well-meaning friends had slowed to a trickle. People didn't know what to say anymore. Any news? They would ask, and Sarah would have to say no. There was no news. There was never any news. After a while, the calls stopped coming altogether. Life moved on for everyone except the Harrison family, frozen in a moment of terrible uncertainty. The insurance company sent letter after letter. They needed a death certificate before they could pay Mike's life insurance policy, but there was no death certificate because there was no body. The state of Illinois required 7 years before someone could be declared legally dead. 7 years of living in limbo, 7 years of not knowing whether to hope or mourn. Sarah found herself driving past the airport almost daily, slowing down as she passed the hangar where Mike kept his business office. She would sit in the parking lot and watch other pilots pre-flight their aircraft, remembering how Mike looked when he walked around his Cessna, checking every detail with the methodical care that had made him such a good pilot. The hangar was for rent now, a yellow sign hanging crookedly on the door. Pastor Coleman visited every week, bringing casseroles and gentle suggestions that Sarah should consider having a memorial service. It might help the children, he said kindly. Give them a chance to say goodbye. But Sarah couldn't say goodbye to someone who might still be alive somewhere, hurt and waiting for rescue. She couldn't bury an empty coffin while Mike might be walking toward home, suffering from amnesia or injuries that kept him from reaching a telephone. The grief counselor at Springfield General Hospital had a name for what Sarah was experiencing. Ambiguous loss. Grief without closure. Mourning without confirmation. It was, the counselor explained, one of the most difficult types of loss to process. Sarah didn't need a name for it. She just needed her husband to come home. Every November 15th, the pilots came. They arrived at Springfield Regional Airport in small groups, flying in from Illinois, Indiana, Missouri, sometimes from as far away as Ohio. They would gather at Mike Harrison's old hangar, now owned by a crop dusting company, and share stories about the pilot who had vanished into the gray sky. Dr. Martin Webb organized the first memorial flight in 1982, 1 year after Mike disappeared. A dozen aircraft took off that morning and flew the same route Mike had taken on his final flight, following the Wabash River Valley northeast toward Chicago. The pilots maintained radio silence for most of the journey, each lost in their own thoughts about a colleague who had simply never come home. We do this because Mike was one of us, Webb told the local newspaper that first year. Pilots take care of pilots. We don't forget. By 1985, the memorial flight had grown to include nearly 50 aircraft. It became an annual tradition that drew pilots from across the Midwest, a reminder that aviation was still dangerous despite all the safety regulations and modern equipment. The flight always ended at the section of river where Mike's debris had been found, with each aircraft making one low pass over the water before turning toward home. Sarah attended every memorial flight for the first 5 years, bringing Tommy and Lisa to watch the airplanes take off in formation. But as the children grew older, and the pain didn't fade, she found it harder to face the annual reminder of her loss. The well-meaning pilots would approach her afterward, asking if there had been any new developments, any fresh leads. There never were. Tommy, now 13, had started building model airplanes with an intensity that worried his mother. His bedroom walls were covered with pictures of aircraft, and he could identify any plane by sound alone, just like his father. He talked constantly about learning to fly when he turned 16, about following in Mike's footsteps. Lisa, 11, had developed a different coping mechanism. She had become obsessed with maps and navigation, studying the river systems of Illinois and Indiana with the dedication of a graduate student. She traced possible flight paths with her finger, calculating where an aircraft might have crashed if it had been blown off course by wind or disoriented by fog. "Maybe Daddy flew somewhere else," Lisa would say, spreading her maps across the kitchen table. "Maybe he got lost and landed in a field somewhere and he's waiting for us to find him." Sarah married again in 1987, 6 years after Mike disappeared. Richard Stern was a kind man, an accountant who had lost his own wife to cancer 3 years earlier. He understood grief and didn't try to replace Mike in the children's hearts. But even Richard sometimes felt like he was sharing his home with a ghost, competing with a memory that grew more perfect with each passing year. The anniversary became a wound that reopened annually. Local newspapers would run retrospective articles. Local pilot, still missing after 6 years. Television stations would broadcast brief updates during slow news cycles. Each story brought a fresh wave of phone calls from people claiming to have seen Mike Harrison somewhere. Always somewhere else. Always just out of reach. In 1989, 8 years after the disappearance, Sarah finally agreed to have a memorial service. Tommy Harrison earned his private pilot's license on his 18th birthday, the same day he graduated from Springfield High School. Sarah had tried to talk him out of it for years, the fear evident in her voice every time he mentioned flying. But Tommy was his father's son, and the pull of aviation was stronger than his mother's worry. "I need to understand what happened to him," Tommy told Sarah as they sat in the parking lot outside Midwest Flight Training, watching him complete his first solo flight. The small Cessna 152 looked tiny against the vast Illinois sky, a fragile speck of metal and dreams climbing toward the clouds. "I need to know what Dad experienced up there." By 2006, 25 years after his father's disappearance, Tommy had become a commercial pilot for a regional airline. He flew the same routes his father once traveled, often passing over the Wabash River valley where Mike Harrison had vanished. Every time he crossed that stretch of water, Tommy would key his radio microphone and speak quietly to the air traffic controller. "Center, this is Express Air, 1847, checking in at flight level 240. Always flight level 240. High enough to see the river winding through the farmland below. High enough to wonder what his father had seen in those final moments." Lisa took a different path, but one equally shaped by her father's disappearance. She became an emergency dispatcher for the Illinois State Police, the voice on the radio that coordinated search and rescue operations across central Illinois. She had trained herself to stay calm during crisis calls, to organize resources efficiently, to never give up hope, even when situations seemed hopeless. "I became the person I wish had been there for Dad," Lisa explained to a reporter on the 20th anniversary of Mike's disappearance. "Someone who would never stop looking, never stop trying." Lisa's apartment was filled with aviation maps and search pattern charts. She had studied every detail of her father's case, memorizing the locations where debris was found, the weather conditions that morning, the timeline of the search efforts. She knew more about aircraft accident investigation than most professional investigators. Sarah's second marriage to Richard Stern had lasted 12 years before the weight of Mike's ghost finally proved too much. Richard was a good man who loved Sarah and tried to be a father to Tommy and Lisa, but he could never compete with a memory that had been polished perfect by grief and time. "It's like living with 3 people," Richard told Sarah during their divorce proceedings in 1999. "You, me, and Mike. And Mike always wins every argument because he's not here to be human anymore." Sarah didn't remarry again. She threw herself into volunteer work at the local hospital and rarely spoke about Mike except on the anniversary of his disappearance. But she kept his pilot's license framed on her bedroom wall, right next to their wedding photo. Some nights, she would catch herself listening for the sound of his Cessna's engine, the familiar rhythm that meant he was coming home. The family had learned to live with questions instead of answers, with hope instead of certainty. They had become experts at carrying grief that had no proper ending, love that had nowhere to go. But they had never stopped believing that someday, somehow, they would learn the truth about what happened on that gray November morning when Mike Harrison flew into the clouds and never came back. Danny Rodriguez had always been fascinated by unsolved mysteries, But it wasn't until he started making documentary films that he realized how many stories were gathering dust in police filing cabinets. In 2010, 29 years after Mike Harrison disappeared, Rodriguez was scrolling through old newspaper archives when he found a brief article about the missing pilot. Something about the case caught his attention, maybe the way it had simply faded from public memory despite never being solved. Rodriguez drove to Springfield on a humid August morning, his camera equipment loaded in the back of his Honda Civic. He had no funding for this project, no television network backing him, just a personal obsession with finding answers. His first stop was the Springfield Regional Airport, where he found Dr. Ender Martin Webb still flying search missions for the Civil Air Patrol at age 73. "That case haunted all of us," Webb told Rodriguez as they sat in the airport restaurant, watching small planes take off and land through the large windows. "Mike Harrison was one of the most careful pilots I ever knew. He didn't take risks. For him to just vanish like that, something catastrophic must have happened." Rodriguez interviewed everyone he could find who remembered the case. Retired sheriff's deputies, former air traffic controllers, pilots who had participated in the search efforts. What struck him was how many details had been forgotten or misremembered over the decades. Witness statements that seemed important in 1981 had been filed away and never revisited. The breakthrough came when Rodriguez visited the National Weather Service office in Lincoln. Meteorologist Karen Brennan had worked there since 1978 and remembered the unusual weather patterns from November 15, 1981. More importantly, she had access to something that didn't exist during the original investigation: computer modeling technology. "We can recreate the exact atmospheric conditions from that morning," Brennan explained, pulling up weather data on her computer screen. "Temperature, humidity, wind patterns, fog density. We can see things now that investigators couldn't see 30 years ago." The computer model revealed something startling. The fog over the Wabash River Valley had been much thicker and more persistent than anyone realized in 1981. Visibility dropped to near zero in several areas along Mike's planned route, creating conditions that would have been impossible to fly through safely. "If Harrison encountered this kind of fog," Brennan said, pointing to a section of the computer display, "he would have had no choice but to descend, try to get underneath it. That puts him dangerously low over water." Rodriguez also discovered that the original search area might have been too narrow. River current studies from the 1980s showed that debris could have traveled much farther downstream than investigators had assumed. The computer models suggested several areas that had never been thoroughly searched. Most intriguingly, Rodriguez found aerial photographs taken by the Illinois Department of Transportation in 1985, 4 years after Mike's disappearance. The photos showed the river at historically low water levels due to a severe drought. In one photograph, taken about 2 miles downstream from where the original debris was found, a dark shadow was visible beneath the water near the riverbank. "That could be anything," admitted Dr. Webb when Rodriguez showed him the photograph. "A log, a rock formation, an old car someone dumped. But it could also be an airplane." The shadow had been underwater for 30 years, waiting for someone to notice it. Jake Morrison had been fishing the Wabash River since he was 8 years old, learning the best spots from his grandfather who had worked the water for 60 years before him. By March 2016, Jake was 45 and owned a small construction company, but every weekend found him back on the river with his younger brother, Pete, casting lines into the muddy water that had fed their family for generations. The Morrison brothers weren't wealthy men, but Jake had saved enough to buy a new fish finder that winter, a fancy electronic device that used sonar to map the river bottom. Pete had laughed when Jake showed up with the expensive gadget, calling it a waste of money for men who could catch fish with nothing but a stick and some string. "You're turning into one of those fancy fishermen," Pete teased as Jake mounted the device to his 16-foot aluminum boat. "Next thing you know, you'll be wearing designer waders and carrying a briefcase full of lures." But Jake was fascinated by the technology. The fish finder painted a detailed picture of what lay beneath the dark water, showing schools of fish, underwater logs, even the contours of the river bottom itself. It was like having X-ray vision, seeing a hidden world that had always been there but never visible to human eyes. On a cold Saturday morning in March, the brothers launched their boat at their usual spot, about 15 miles northeast of Springfield. The winter had been harsh, and ice still clung to the banks in places where the sun couldn't reach. The water was higher than normal from spring snowmelt, running fast and brown with runoff from the surrounding farmland. Jake steered the boat to a quiet backwater area where they had caught bass the previous fall. Pete was already rigging his rod when Jake glanced down at the fish finder screen and saw something that made him cut the engine. "What are you doing?" Pete asked, looking up from his tackle box. "This is a good spot. The fish stack up right here, where the current slows down." Jake stared at the sonar display, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. About 25 feet below the surface, the fish finder showed a large object on the river bottom, something too symmetrical to be a fallen tree, too big to be a rock. The shape was roughly rectangular with what looked like protrusions extending from both sides. "Pete, look at this," Jake said, pointing to the screen. "What do you think that is?" Pete leaned over to examine the display, his eyes narrowing as he studied the sonar image. He had worked construction for 20 years and knew how to read technical drawings and blueprints. This object had straight lines, defined edges, definitely something man-made. "That's not natural," Pete said slowly. "Logs don't look like that. Rocks don't look like that. That's something that was built by people." Jake marked the GPS coordinates on his fish finder and took a screenshot of the sonar image. The object measured approximately 28 feet long and appeared to be sitting upright on the river bottom, as if it had settled there gently rather than tumbling down from the surface. Neither brother said the word airplane out loud, but they both knew what they might have found in the dark water beneath their boat. Jake Morrison couldn't sleep that night. The sonar image burned in his mind like a neon sign, that strange rectangular shape sitting on the river bottom 25 feet below the surface. He had fished that stretch of the Wabash River hundreds of times over the years, but the new fish finder had revealed something that had been hidden in the murky depths for decades. At breakfast the next morning, Jake's wife Carol found him staring at his phone, studying the screenshot he had taken of the sonar display. She had been married to Jake for 22 years and knew the look on his face. He wouldn't let this go until he had answers. "You think it's that missing pilot, don't you?" Carol said, pouring coffee into Jake's favorite mug. "The one from way back when we were kids." Jake nodded slowly. He remembered the searches from 1981. He remembered his father talking about the pilot who had vanished somewhere over the river. Everyone in the area knew the story, passed down through fishing guides and local families like river folklore. "I have to go back," Jake told his wife. "I have to see what's down there." The following Saturday, both Morrison brothers returned to the GPS coordinates with more than just fishing gear. Jake had borrowed underwater camera equipment from his cousin who worked for the county water department, and Pete had brought his old scuba gear from his Navy days. The water would be murky and dangerous, but they had to know what they had found. The current was stronger than usual from recent rains, making it difficult to hold the boat in position over the object. Jake dropped anchor upstream and let the boat drift back to the marked spot, watching the fish finder screen until the mysterious shape appeared again, exactly where they had left it. Pete suited up in his wetsuit and scuba gear, checking his equipment twice before entering the water. The visibility was terrible, maybe 3 feet at best, but he followed the anchor line down through the brown water until his fins touched the silty river bottom. At first, Pete couldn't see anything through the murky water. He swept his underwater flashlight back and forth, the beam barely penetrating the sediment-filled darkness. Then his light caught something that made his heart stop. A straight line where there should have been only river bottom curves. Metal where there should have been only mud and rocks. Pete swam closer, his flashlight beam revealing more details with each kick of his fins. Red and white paint, faded but still visible after 35 years underwater. The distinctive shape of an aircraft wing, partially buried in river silt. And there, barely readable through the mud and algae, 3 numbers and a letter painted on what remained of the fuselage. 847X. Pete's training took over, and he began filming with the underwater camera, documenting everything he could see. The aircraft was sitting upright on the river bottom, nose pointed downstream, as if the pilot had attempted a controlled water landing. The cockpit area was partially collapsed, filled with decades of river sediment. When Pete surfaced 20 minutes later, gasping and pulling off his diving mask, Jake knew immediately from his brother's expression that their lives had just changed forever. "Call the police," Pete said, treading water beside the boat. "We found Mike Harrison." The crowd at the boat launch had grown to nearly 100 people by the time the recovery barge arrived on Wednesday morning. Word had spread quickly through Springfield and the surrounding towns that Mike Harrison's missing aircraft had finally been found. News trucks lined the gravel road leading to the river, their satellite dishes pointed skyward like metal flowers reaching for the Sunday. Sarah Harrison sat in a folding chair beside the water, wrapped in a heavy coat against the March chill. Tommy and Lisa flanked her on either sides, their own chairs pulled close enough that their knees almost touched. For 35 years, they had wondered where Mike was, imagined him in 1,000 different scenarios. Now they knew he had been here all along, 25 feet beneath the brown water that had hidden him from the world. The professional salvage team from Chicago had arrived at dawn with specialized equipment. A floating crane, underwater cutting tools, and lifting bags designed to raise sunken vessels. Captain Bruce Martinez had recovered everything from pleasure boats to tractor-trailers from rivers and lakes across the Midwest, but he had never worked on a case this old or this emotionally charged. "We're going to take this very slowly," Martinez explained to the assembled investigators and family members. "The aircraft has been underwater for 35 years. The structure may be fragile, and we need to preserve as much evidence as possible for the NTSB investigation." Jake and Pete Morrison stood near their small fishing boat, which looked tiny next to the massive recovery barge. The brothers had guided the salvage team to the exact GPS coordinates where they had first spotted the mysterious shape on their fish finder. Pete had made 3 more dives over the past week, documenting the aircraft's position and condition with underwater cameras. The first step was clearing away 35 years of accumulated river silt that had settled around and inside the aircraft. Divers used high-pressure water jets to carefully wash away the mud, revealing more details of the Cessna's structure with each pass. The red and white paint scheme was still visible in places, though faded and covered with algae. Dr. Susan Martinez from the NTSB watched the operation from the deck of the recovery barge, taking notes and photographs as each section of the aircraft was exposed. The engine was intact, still mounted to the firewall. The propeller blades were bent backward, indicating the engine had been running when the aircraft hit the water. The landing gear was retracted, confirming that Mike Harrison had been attempting a planned water landing rather than an uncontrolled crash. "The preservation is remarkable, Doctor," Martinez told the gathered investigators. Cold water and thick silt created perfect conditions for preserving both the aircraft structure and, unfortunately, human remains. The most delicate part of the operation came when divers reached the cockpit area. Mike Harrison's remains were still strapped into the pilot's seat, his hands positioned on the controls as if he had been flying the aircraft until the moment of impact. The recovery team treated the cockpit like an archaeological site, carefully documenting the position of every switch, lever, and instrument before beginning the extraction process. Sarah Harrison closed her eyes when the divers surfaced with news that human remains had been found. After 35 years of hoping Mike might somehow still be alive, the final confirmation of his death hit her like a physical blow. Tommy put his arm around his mother's shoulders while Lisa gripped her hand tightly. The actual lifting operation took 4 hours. Heavy cables were attached to the aircraft's main structural points, and slowly, carefully, the Cessna began its journey back to the surface. Water poured from the cockpit and cabin as the nose broke through, followed by the wings and finally the tail section. A collective gasp rose from the crowd as Mike Harrison's red and white Cessna 172, tail number N2000, 847X, emerged from the Wabash River for the first time since November 15, 1981. The aircraft was remarkably intact, its aluminum skin dented but not torn apart. Even the windscreen was still in place, though clouded by decades underwater. "My God," whispered Dr. Martin Webb, the Civil Air Patrol volunteer who had searched for Mike's plane in 1981. There at Island, after all these years, there at Island. The aircraft was gently lowered onto a specially designed trailer that would transport it to a hangar at Springfield Regional Airport for detailed examination. As the crane operators secured the Cessna for transport, Sarah Harrison stood and walked slowly toward the trailer. She reached out and touched the wing, the same wing Mike had patted reassuringly on that gray November morning when he told his nervous passenger that his little bird would get them to Chicago just fine. "Welcome home, Mike," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the recovery equipment. "Welcome home." The hangar at Springfield Regional Airport had never been so quiet. Inside the cavernous space, Mike Harrison's Cessna 172 sat on blocks like a patient on an operating table, surrounded by investigators, photographers, and equipment that would have seemed like science fiction in 1981. After 35 years underwater, the aircraft was about to reveal its secrets. Dr. Susan Martinez from the National Transportation Safety Board had supervised aircraft recoveries from lakes, rivers, and oceans, but she had never worked on a case this old. The Wabash River had been surprisingly kind to the Cessna's aluminum structure. The cold water and thick silt had created an environment that preserved metal and plastic better than exposure to air and sunlight would have. "Remarkable preservation," Dr. Martinez told the assembled team as they began their examination. "The fuselage is intact, the engine is complete, even some of the fabric interior has survived. This aircraft is going to tell us exactly what happened on November 15, 1981. The cockpit area drew immediate attention. Mike Harrison's remains, identified through dental records the day before, were still strapped into the pilot's seat. The position of his body told a story of a pilot fighting for control until the very end. His hands were still gripping the control wheel, his feet positioned on the rudder pedals as if he had been trying to keep the aircraft level during an emergency landing. More telling were the instrument panel and engine controls. The mixture control was pulled to full rich, exactly what a pilot would do if he suspected carburetor ice was choking off fuel flow to the engine. The carburetor heat lever was pulled to the on position. Mike Harrison had recognized the problem and taken the correct action to solve it. "He did everything right," said Tom Bradley, the original NTSB investigator who had come out of retirement to see the case finally resolved. This pilot knew he was in trouble and followed proper emergency procedures. The problem was that he ran out of time and altitude. The engine examination revealed the smoking gun. When investigators removed the carburetor and disassembled it in the hangar, they found exactly what they expected. Ice crystals had formed in the carburetor throat, gradually choking off the fuel and air mixture that kept the engine running. In the conditions that existed over the Wabash River that morning, ice could have formed within minutes. "This is a textbook case of carburetor icing," explained engine specialist Robert Chen, the same Robert Chen who had been Mike's passenger that November morning and whose remains were found in the right seat. Temperature was 38 degrees, humidity was 95%, perfect conditions for ice formation. The propeller blades showed evidence of power-on impact with the water, confirming that Mike had been attempting to restart the engine right up until the moment of impact. Scratch marks on the instrument panel suggested he had been trying to troubleshoot the problem, perhaps checking circuit breakers or fuel valve positions. The aircraft's altimeter was frozen at 200 feet above sea level, roughly the altitude of the river surface. Mike Harrison had managed to glide his powerless aircraft nearly 20 miles before running out of altitude and options. In the end, the investigation confirmed what pilots had suspected for 35 years. Mike Harrison was a victim of weather conditions beyond his control and physics that gave him no chance of survival. The NTSB conference room in Washington, D.C., had hosted thousands of aircraft accident briefings over the decades, but few cases had taken 35 years to reach their conclusion. On a humid Tuesday morning in August 2016, Dr. Susan Martinez stood before a room full of reporters, aviation safety experts, and family members to deliver the final report on the disappearance of Mike Harrison. Sarah Harrison, now 72 years old, sat in the front row between her children, Tommy and Lisa. Tommy wore his airline pilot's uniform, having taken time off from his job with United Airlines to attend the briefing. Lisa had driven down from Chicago, where she worked as an emergency communications supervisor. After 35 years of questions, they were finally going to get answers. The National Transportation Safety Board determines that the probable cause of this accident was carburetor ice formation that resulted in total engine power loss at an altitude too low to permit a successful emergency landing. Dr. Martinez read from the official report. Contributing factors were weather conditions conducive to carburetor icing and the pilot's location over water when the emergency occurred. The technical language couldn't capture the human drama of those final minutes, but the evidence painted a clear picture. Mike Harrison had been flying through patchy fog over the Wabash River when ice began forming in his carburetor, gradually choking off power to the engine. He had recognized the problem immediately and taken the correct action, but the ice had formed too quickly for the carburetor heat to clear it completely. Mr. Harrison followed proper emergency procedures, Dr. Martinez continued. He applied carburetor heat, enriched the fuel mixture, and attempted to restart the engine multiple times. His actions were consistent with his training and experience as a commercial pilot. The final moments of Flight N2000, 847X, had been reconstructed using computer modeling and analysis of the wreckage. Mike had managed to glide the powerless Cessna for nearly 20 miles, stretching every foot of altitude as he searched for a place to land. But there were no airports within gliding distance, no suitable fields large enough for an emergency landing. The pilot's decision to attempt a water landing was reasonable given the circumstances, the report stated. Analysis of the wreckage indicates he maintained control of the aircraft until impact, and likely saved his passenger's life by keeping the aircraft level during the emergency descent. The investigation had found no evidence of pilot error, mechanical failure, or maintenance problems. Mike Harrison had been the victim of a perfect storm of atmospheric conditions that created carburetor ice faster than he could eliminate it. The same weather conditions that had grounded other flights that morning, the conditions that meteorologists now understood much better than they did in 1981. Tommy Harrison wiped his eyes as Dr. Martinez concluded her presentation. For 35 years, he had wondered if his father had made a mistake, if better training or different decisions might have prevented the tragedy. Now he knew the truth. Mike Harrison had been an excellent pilot who faced an impossible situation and handled it with skill and courage. "Dad was a hero," Tommy whispered to his mother as the briefing ended. "He never gave up fighting." Sarah squeezed her son's hand and nodded. After 35 years, Mike Harrison could finally rest in peace. The cemetery on Elm Street had never seen a gathering quite like this. On a warm September morning in 2016, nearly 300 people surrounded the gravesite where Mike Harrison would finally be laid to rest, 35 years after he disappeared into the Illinois sky. The headstone was simple, black granite with gold lettering. Michael Harrison, loving husband and father, 1947 1981, he followed his dreams to the sky. Sarah Harrison stood beside the grave, her hand resting on Tommy's arm for support. She was 72 now, her hair silver white, her face lined with decades of worry that could finally end. The funeral director had asked if she wanted a closed casket service, given the condition of the remains after so many years underwater. Sarah had chosen cremation instead. It seemed more fitting somehow, returning Mike to the elements where he had always felt most at home. Pastor Coleman from First Methodist Church, now retired but still officiating at special occasions, spoke about the long journey to this moment. For 35 years, this family lived with questions instead of answers, hope instead of certainty. Today, Mike Harrison comes home at last. The pilot community had turned out in force. Dr. Martin Webb, now 78 and still flying, had organized a flyover of 12 aircraft that passed overhead just as the service began. The planes flew in formation, then broke away one by one in the missing man formation, leaving a gap in the sky where Mike's aircraft should have been. Tommy Harrison, now a captain with United Airlines, spoke on behalf of the family. His voice was steady, seasoned by years of speaking over aircraft radio systems, but his eyes were wet with tears he had held back for decades. "My father was a pilot who understood that flying involved risks," Tommy said, looking out at the crowd of faces, many of whom had searched for Mike in those desperate days after his disappearance. But he also understood that some things in life are worth the risk. His love for aviation, his dedication to his passengers, his commitment to safety, these defined who he was. Lisa Harrison, now working as a supervisor for Illinois State Police Communications, had struggled with whether to speak at the service. She had spent her career coordinating search and rescue operations, always thinking about her father, always hoping the next call wouldn't end the way his story had. Finally, she stepped forward to the microphone. "Dad never came home from work on November 15th, 1981, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the cemetery. "But today, 35 years later, he's finally here. We know what happened. We know he did everything he could. We know he didn't abandon us." Some questions would never be answered. Why had the original search teams missed the aircraft, sitting in 25 feet of water less than 2 miles from where they found the debris? The river had been searched with boats and divers, but the technology of 1981 couldn't penetrate the murky water the way modern sonar could. The Cessna had likely been buried in silt within days of the crash, invisible to the searchers who had worked so desperately to find it. Jake and Pete Morrison attended the service, the fishermen whose curiosity had finally solved the mystery. They stood quietly at the back of the crowd, uncomfortable with the attention their discovery had brought them. The discovery of Mike Harrison's aircraft sent shockwaves through the aviation community that reached far beyond Springfield, Illinois. Within weeks of the NTSB's final report, flying magazines and safety publications were running detailed articles about carburetor icing, a hazard that had been killing pilots for decades but was often misunderstood or underestimated. Captain Jennifer Walsh from the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association used Harrison's case as the centerpiece of a new safety campaign. Mike Harrison was an experienced, careful pilot who did everything right, Walsh explained during a seminar at the annual aviation convention in Chicago. But carburetor ice doesn't care about your experience level. It can kill a 20,000-hour airline pilot just as easily as a student on his first solo flight. The Federal Aviation Administration took notice as well. By December 2016, new regulations required all flight training schools to dedicate additional hours to weather-related emergencies, with specific emphasis on carburetor ice recognition and prevention. Flight instructors were required to demonstrate the effects of carburetor ice using special training devices that simulated the gradual power loss that had trapped Mike Harrison. "We can't bring Mike Harrison back," said FAA Administrator Rebecca Torres during a press conference announcing the new regulations. "But we can make sure future pilots are better prepared for the conditions he faced." The ripple effects extended beyond aviation safety. The Illinois State Police updated their search and rescue protocols based on lessons learned from the Harrison case. New sonar equipment was purchased for underwater recovery teams, and search patterns were expanded to account for how aircraft debris could travel much farther in rivers than previously understood. Documentary filmmaker Danny Rodriguez completed his film about the Harrison case in early 2017. The Pilot Who Vanished premiered at the Chicago International Film Festival and later aired on the Discovery Channel, winning a regional Emmy Award for Outstanding Investigative Journalism. The film raised awareness about dozens of other unsolved aviation disappearances across the country. Every missing aircraft represents a family living in limbo, Rodriguez said during his Emmy acceptance speech. Technology exists now that didn't exist 30 years ago. We have an obligation to use it. The Harrison family used the renewed attention to establish the Mike Harrison Aviation Safety Foundation, funded partly by a settlement with the aircraft manufacturer over inadequate carburetor ice warnings in the pilot's handbook. The foundation provided scholarships for young pilots and funded research into general aviation safety improvements. Tommy Harrison left his job with United Airlines in 2018 to become the foundation's full-time director. Dad always said that learning from accidents was the only way aviation could become safer, Tommy explained to reporters. This foundation is his way of still teaching, still helping other pilots avoid the trap that caught him. The foundation's first major project was developing a smartphone app that provided real-time carburetor ice warnings based on current weather conditions. By 2019, the app had been downloaded by over 50,000 pilots and was credited with preventing at least 12 potential accidents. Jake and Pete Morrison, the fishermen who found the aircraft, became reluctant celebrities in the search and rescue community. They were invited to speak at conferences about the importance of civilian involvement in missing person cases and the potential of modern technology to solve cold cases. "We were just fishing," Pete always said when asked about their discovery. But maybe that's how most mysteries get solved. Regular people paying attention to things that seem out of place. On a crisp October morning in 2019, almost 40 years after Mike Harrison disappeared, his grandson, Jake Harrison, took his first solo flight from Springfield Regional Airport. The 19-year-old college student had inherited his grandfather's passion for aviation and his father Tommy's steady hands on the controls. As the small Cessna 152 climbed into the autumn sky, 3 generations of Harrison pilots were finally connected across time and tragedy. Sarah Harrison, now 75, watched from the terminal window as her grandson's aircraft grew smaller against the blue sky. She had fought Tommy's decision to let Jake learn to fly, the old fears rising up like ghosts from 1981, but Tommy had been patient with his mother's concerns, just as Mike would have been. Dad would want his grandson to fly, Tommy had told Sarah months earlier when Jake first expressed interest in getting his pilot's license. He wouldn't want his accident to end the family tradition. He'd want us to learn from what happened to him and be better, safer pilots because of it. The Mike Harrison Aviation Safety Foundation had grown beyond anyone's expectations. By 2019, the foundation had provided flight training scholarships to over 300 young pilots and funded research that led to new carburetor ice detection systems in thousands of aircraft. The smartphone app that warned pilots about icing conditions had been downloaded in over 40 countries and translated into 12 languages. Lisa Harrison had married in 2017 and taken her husband's name, but she kept a photo of her father in his pilot's uniform on her desk at the Illinois State Police Communications Center. She had risen to become the state's director of emergency communications, overseeing search and rescue operations across Illinois. Every missing aircraft report that crossed her desk reminded her of the long years her family had waited for answers. "We respond faster now, we search more thoroughly, and we never give up," Lisa told a reporter on the 40th anniversary of her father's disappearance. "Every family deserves to know what happened to their loved one. Every family deserves the closure we finally found." The original Cessna 172, tail number N2847X, found its final resting place in the National Museum of Flight in Washington, D.C. The aircraft sat in a special exhibit about aviation safety, surrounded by photographs of Mike Harrison and his family, weather charts from November 15, 1981, and interactive displays that taught visitors about the dangers of carburetor ice. Children on school field trips would stand before the weathered red and white aircraft and listen to museum guides explain how one pilot's tragic accident had led to safety improvements that saved other lives. The Cessna was no longer just wreckage from a long-ago crash. It had become a teacher, still serving aviation even decades after its final flight. Jake Morrison and Pete Morrison, the fishermen whose curiosity had solved the 35-year mystery, continued to fish the Wabash River every weekend. They had become local legends, the men who gave a family the answers they needed. Other families with missing relatives sometimes contacted the brothers, hoping they might find more secrets hidden beneath the water. The river keeps its secrets for a long time, Jake Morrison would tell visitors to their small tackle shop. But sometimes, if you're patient and you pay attention, it gives them back. Mike Harrison's story had become more than just a tale of tragedy and loss. It was a reminder that love doesn't end with death, that families can find strength in the darkest times, and that sometimes the answers we seek are closer than we think, waiting beneath the surface for someone to look in the right place at the right time. Sarah Harrison passed away peacefully in 2021, 40 years after Mike's disappearance. At her funeral, Tommy read from a letter she had written to be opened after her death. "I spent half my life waiting for Mike to come home," the letter said. "Now I know he was home all along, in the hearts of his children, in the safety improvements that bear his name, in every pilot who learned from his story. Love doesn't vanish, even when the person we love disappears. Love just finds new ways to keep flying."